Yes, Mr. Vaughan.
Before we call our next witness, we'd like to hand up a few exhibits, some of which we will be referring to in this morning's evidence. My junior has been working out the exhibit numbers. It might be helpful if I handed up the bundle of documents and we could work through them to allot them exhibit numbers. Which is first?
Have you made copies to other council?
All other council have copies.
Okay.
That page. Lord, perhaps we can start with the copy with the faded 1914 Act, which we referred to yesterday in Mr. Frank Dutton's evidence when he made reference to the personal file of Mr. Rodriguez that reflected a conviction for statutory perjury under a 1914 Act, number 16. We'd like to give that exhibit number H9.
H9?
Yes.
Yes.
And then perhaps we can move on to the resume, the CV, for our witness this morning, Mr. Tivash Mudli. And we'd like to make that part of volume C, and the exhibit number would be C9.
Yes, it's C9.
And then the report drawn up by Mr. Mudli, which has the letterhead TMI Dynamatics, dated 24 July. That's also part of volume C, and the exhibit number would be C10. What's the exhibit number? Oh, it's already in this pocket. Lord, we've also supplied photographs downloaded from Google Earth. These are aerial pictures of John Vorster Square. And the exhibit number would be C11.
It's marked accordingly.
And finally, Your Lordship, we might make reference to a photograph that appears on the front cover of the report newspaper. There is no need to give this particular photocopy an exhibit number because it is already in volume D at page 95. It's simply a blown-up version of that photograph.
Yeah.
Lord, that concludes the exhibits for this morning. And the leave of the court, I'd like to call our witness for this morning,
Yes.
who is Mr. Tanesh Mudli.
Do you have any objection to taking the oath? Do you swear that the evidence that is about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please raise your right hand and say so help me God.
Mr. Mutlu, you may sit down if you wish to. Just make sure that you speak in the microphone. Yes.
Mr. Mudli, good morning, and thanks for taking time out of your schedule. I know as an aeronautical engineer, you have a lot on your plate, so we're very grateful. And thanks again for taking time out of your schedule to prepare a report which we have submitted to this court. Before we deal with the report, can you give the court a sense of your experience, education, and expertise, please?
My Lord, I'm a 43-year-old male. I graduated as an aeronautical engineer in 1998 and worked up until 2012 quite heavily as an aeronautical engineer, specializing in trajectory calculations for weapons, typically bombs, missiles, aircraft, helicopters. Thereafter, I worked mostly as a trajectory specialist on motor vehicles and their basic motion through different maneuvers, skidding, swerving, and high-speed driving, low-speed driving. So I have almost 19 years experience in the field of trajectory calculations in air, land, and on water.
Thank you, Mr. Mudli. Mr. Mudli, can I just check that you have certain documents with you? Can you confirm that you prepared a report for this court on behalf of the Timol family, dated 24th July, dealing with your views on aspects relating to the trajectory of the fall of the late Mr. Timol?
Yes, I do.
And you have a copy of that report with you?
So, my Lord, I do.
Can I just check that you also have copies of other documents that we might refer to? Color photographs depicting aerial Google Earth downloads of John Foster Square, the building?
My Lord, I can confirm I have 6, 7, 8 pages of aerial photographs in color of John Foster Square and the surrounding area.
And you also have a picture taken of room 1026, which depicts the scene shortly after the fall.
My Lord, I do have that picture.
My Lord, just for the record, this photocopy has been marked C8 and was handed up, I think, yesterday. Mr. Mudli, before we ask you to guide us through your report, did you have sight of various documents? And perhaps I can take you through and you can just confirm whether it was the case or not. And these are documents that you would have consulted with in preparing for the report as well as preparing for your testimony today. Firstly, the affidavit of Warrant Officer Dazel.
I do.
Brigadier Patel.
I do.
Sergeant Rodriguez.
I do.
The affidavit of Token Ali, who was at the filling station and heard the body fall.
I do.
Dr. Holland, who prepared a forensic pathology report.
I do.
Dr. Naidu, who also prepared a forensic pathology report.
I do.
Dr. Skeepers, who had prepared a post-mortem report.
I can't recall having seen that one.
Okay, we might have to come to that one. And did you have sight of the finding of the magistrate? In the original
I do.
Mr. Moodley, did you visit John Vorster Square to inspect the building? And if so, can you recall which places you inspected?
I visited John Vorster Square last week. I basically went to room 1026 on the 10th floor, and I went to the roof just directly above room 1026, and I also walked to the site where it was alleged that the body had landed.
Thank you. Now that we have that background out of the way, you can now guide us through your report. And please be aware that we are all lay people when it comes to engineering and mathematical calculations. And that from time to time you may have to explain to us what certain technical terms mean. And perhaps begin with the basic data that you gather.
Well, Lord, I will. So, having received the information and the documents from the council, Weber Wenzel, I went through everything that would pertain to information that would assist me in determining what typical trajectories the body would move through the air with. The basic data I gathered was of Mr. Timol, a height of 1.6 meters, a weight of 61 kgs. And from the pathology reports that I saw, it was evident that Mr. Timol was slender in build. I also reviewed the security police's account of the incident of late Mr. Timol's fall. It basically said that Mr. Timol was in good health and in good spirit at the time of the incident. So I concluded from that he would have been fit and he would have had full capability and movement in his body so that he would be able to use his limbs to the best of his ability given his weight and his build. I also learned that Mr. Timol ran towards a window, opened the window, climbed onto the windowsill and jumped. In the midst of jumping, he was allegedly restrained by a security officer who grabbed onto his leg. I then went on, when I went to John Vorster Square, I looked at the area around the window. I looked at the window in detail. I looked at the mechanisms that the window had, and I'd like to describe it. The window that Mr. Late Timol allegedly fell out of can be described as a steel window frame that opened 90 degrees at a 90-degree angle to the frame and had a hinge point that was approximately 27 centimeters from the right edge. The window pane had a rotating lever that was used to latch the pane onto the window frame that resulted in the window opening in a clockwise direction from left to right. Furthermore, the window pane was braced with an additional lever that could be locked to prevent the window from closing in windy conditions. In the report that I wrote, I drew the orientation of the window, and with the dimensions of the window being 155 centimeters high, a width of 71 centimeters, and the area that Mr. Timol had to fit through was 44 centimeters. I then also looked at papers on forensics regarding people jumping from buildings and cliffs.
Mr. Moodley, if I can interrupt you just for one moment. Before we move on to the trajectory, given the police version that you have just recounted for us, and given your examination of the physical attributes of room 1026 and the attributes and measurements of the window itself, would you be able to give this court an approximate estimation of how long it might have taken Mr. Timol to move from his seat? And for that purpose, I'd like you to consult Exhibit C8, which has a blown-up photocopied photograph of room 1026. And according to the evidence, Mr. Timol was seated in seat B, and Mr. Rodriguez in seat A. And we know from the evidence of Mr. Rodriguez that he allegedly exited out of the left window, close to where Mr. Rodriguez is standing. Would you have a rough estimation of how long it would have taken Mr. Timol to essentially get onto that window and exit?
My Lord, I can try, but this can be done experimentally as well, which we haven't done yet. But I would like to state that from what I read, Mr. Timol, sitting on chair B, had to get up out of chair B, turn around, run towards the door, and as he ran towards the door, he would have to turn around again, run towards the left table, maneuver around that left table, and run on the left side of the table that he was sitting at. He would then need to basically climb that windowsill, which is approximately 950 millimeters high, climb onto the ledge, and then jump. If I had to add some times to that, I would say to move from B in the direction of the door would probably have taken him 1 second. To move from the door back to the corner of the table, maybe another second. To maneuver around there, another second, so 3 seconds. And to climb up onto the windowsill, about 2 seconds. That's a total of 5 seconds if he did it efficiently. If he did it and he took his time in doing that, because I believe that he asked to go to the toilet, and that's why he moved in the direction of the door, it would meant that he would have walked towards the door. I believe that to move from B to basically to the door would have taken him about 2 seconds, and then to run the rest of the way, it would have taken him a few more seconds to get to the corner. So it could be between 5 and 8 seconds for him to get onto the ledge of the window. So if he was efficient, about 5. If he basically took his time to move towards the door first and then run back towards the window, about 8 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Moodley. Please proceed with your evidence in relation to the trajectory. I believe you were on page 2 of your report.
Yes. So if you look at figure 1.2, it gives you some basic orientation dimensions of how somebody would jump from a building or a cliff. Important dimensions to remember is the person's center of mass. The center of mass is a very important parameter because most bodies will rotate around the center of mass. The height that the center of mass is above the ground is also important because that will tell us the time it took to fall through that height. The flight distance would be the distance from the point of takeoff to the point of landing in the horizontal plane. The launch angle and the launch velocity is extremely important because that sets up the initial condition. And most people who would intend on jumping would always launch partly vertically and partly horizontally because you're lunging, right? And in my sort of analysis of what a jump would be if somebody's trying to escape, is they would try and jump with full force so they could get away as fast as possible, and the momentum that they had built up in towards running there, combined with the adrenaline, would give them energy to jump at their full force. When we do a trajectory calculation, it's very important for us to determine a few factors. The first factor that we need to understand is how long would it take for a body that's falling to reach the ground? And having known that, based on the initial conditions of the launch, how far would that body land from the initial launch position? The final velocity at the instant of the impact, and the impact forces or the change in moment when the body contacts with the ground. What I basically did thereafter was I looked at the descriptions of what people said in statements at how the late Mr. Ahmed Timol fell, and it was important to take everybody's considerations take everybody's statements into consideration. So, Mr. J. Rodriguez's statement stated that Mr. Timol allegedly jumped out of the window from room 1026. His statement had a page missing, which described the entire action. So we couldn't draw more there. All we could assume from that statement was that the person jumped out of the window. Then there was a Mr. J. G. Daisel's statement, who basically gave a statement of the body being found on the ground. And his statement stated that the deceased had fallen into some shrubbery on some sandy ground. The deceased body was lying perpendicular to the building with the head pointing towards the building and the legs pointing towards the road. The deceased was lying on his stomach with his face pointing slightly to the right. This extract was taken out of the forensic pathologist Dr. S. Naidu's report. Then on Monday, we heard Advocate E.A. Mathis' testimony. Advocate Mathis' recollection of the body falling was as follows. The body was falling horizontally on its side, not head or feet first. The body was falling parallel to the building with the head in the direction of the motorway. That means the head was facing in a westerly direction. Right? The body landed approximately 1.5 meters away from the building in the same direction, parallel to the building it was falling, and the head was still pointing in the direction of the highway or motorway in a westerly direction. On the ground, the late Mr. Timol had one hand extended over his head while the other hand was under his body. When Advocate Mathis looked out the window, he saw a body lying approximately 1.5 meters away from the building in a similar posture as what he saw it falling. He also said he looked up, and when he looked up, he did not see any window open. Reviewing these statements and these testimonies of these people, basically what I then did was looked at each one of those statements. So if you looked at Mr. J.A. Rodriguez and a jumping statement, I took two scenarios with that. One where somebody would jump with maximum sort of energy to try and get away as far as possible, and another scenario where they would just step. So that would be scenario 1 and 2. I then took Mr. J.A. Daisel's version and I created another 2 scenarios. That would be scenario 3 and 4. So scenario 3 would be basically somebody plot or put onto the windowsill in a seating position, and while seated they are pushed from above the center of gravity, so anywhere above the center of gravity, which is typically around the waist area, so on his shoulders or above back, shoulders, head possibly. And then the other scenario, scenario 4, I looked at whereby somebody or he would climb out leg first and then be pushed by the head and shoulders out the window, so that he would land in the same direction looking at the building. So basically when he exited in scenario 4, he would be looking into the room with his legs out of the window and basically either pushed or propelled outwards. Scenario 5 and 6 referred to Mathis's testimony, and in that version of Mathis's testimony, he says that the body fell parallel to the face of the building in a horizontal position with the head pointing in the direction of the motorway. And I basically created 2 scenarios whereby I didn't believe a body could fall in that direction if it exited out of that window, because the window opened clockwise with the glass pane, and I will refer to a figure that's later on in this report that basically says that Timol could not have exited the window towards the right because the glass and the window pane would have obstructed him from doing that. So he either exited in that orientation below the window or above the window. So it could bring the roof into play in that. So that's with Mathis's evidence, I basically looked at the scenario of a body being thrown from the roof down parallel to the building or rolled off the parapet wall. I'll go back to how I then, the approach I used to compute the trajectory. In the engineering world, there's different mathematical models, but the 2 common solutions are a kinematic solution, which only looks at time, distance, and velocity. And then there's a Lagrangian systems of equations that solves a dynamic system of equations that basically looks at external forces and internal forces. Your external forces would typically be the gravitational force that the Earth exists, or that the Earth exists on our body due to rotation, the aerodynamic force due to the density of the air and the speed that you're traveling through air, and the third force that I looked at was the just go back to it, an impulse force that would be generated either internally by somebody using their legs to thrust themselves, using their hands to propel themselves, or somebody pushing or prodding at them. So the external and internal forces there. And what we then do is, all this analogy is based on Newton's laws of motion, right, which basically led to a lot of engineering problems being solved when the apple didn't fall too far from his head. I then researched information on the aerodynamics because the gravity is fairly common and is well known. His mass would not change during his trajectory, it's constant. The gravitational force would be constant because he's not traveling that far. It's 35 meters. So the aerodynamics that I've looked for was basically the aerodynamics of a body in different posture positions, and I'll refer to figure 3.1 for that. Taylor's University in Malaysia did computational fluid dynamics analysis and solutions around the drag of a body in different postures when it basically falls. So a person who's standing, right, would almost have the highest drag coefficient. A person that is squatting or in a supine position, so supine position means that the airflow, or if you picture somebody flying head first, is supine, where the air flows through the smallest cross-section of the body, which would be his head and shoulder area, has the lowest drag coefficient. The sitting position has an intermediate drag coefficient, and the squatting position also has an intermediate. So I used that report to create and develop the 6 scenarios. Scenario 1, and I'll refer to it in the table 1. Basically, we calculated the height of the building to be roughly 35 meters high from the point of impact to the point where the center of gravity would be on the windowsill. And if you looked at the height of the roof, we then said the roof would be another 3 meters above that point. How did I apply impulse forces? Was I took approximations of his mass and a relative quantity of his mass and applied it to his body for 0.5 seconds in impulse. Because if somebody pushes you, they would push you for a certain distance and release you because they're not holding on to you, right? They're just pushing, the action of pushing. So it's an impulse force. So it means it's applied over a specific period of time. I then looked at, so if we look at scenario 1 where he jumped, right? The height he jumped from was 35 meters. The impulse force that was applied to his body was 48 kilograms, 4.5 seconds. The aerodynamic drag coefficient in a standing position in the horizontal direction was 1. The aerodynamic drag in the vertical direction was 0.25, because when he was falling through the air feet first, I assumed that his body was intact, and it's the smallest cross-sectional area of his body.
Mr. Midley, you're referring to
Table 1.
Table 1.
Yes.
Page 6.
I'm referring to Table 1 on page 6. I then looked at the surface area in the horizontal direction and the surface area in the vertical direction. And from there, I calculated a trajectory, which in section 3.1, it gives you the plot of his trajectory for a scenario where he jumped, we would have jumped. Given that he jumped with almost 75% of his own weight in a 45-degree angle, I computed that he would have landed 13 meters away from the building, provided that he jumped leg first.
And that's a graph on page 7.
That's the graph on page 7, right? And below that graph is the time that it took for him to reach the ground, which was about 3.65 seconds, right?
And Mr. Moodley, in your estimation, 13 meters would probably take him onto the road.
From when we were standing at John Foster Square, I strongly believe that he would have actually cleared the existing fence that's there and probably landed on the road. I did not measure the distance to the road.
Thank you.
I then looked at scenario 2, where I said that Mr. Timol would have just stepped out of the window to just get away from his from the situation that was in. And again, the height that he fell from that position was 35 meters. His impulse force would be equivalent to somebody stepping, and I said that he would have stepped with about 20 kg force for about 0.5 seconds. His aerodynamic drag would be the same as when he was jumping, and his surface area would be same. And if you looked at figure or section 3.2, scenario 2, you would find that he would have landed 4 meters away from the face of the building, jumping the same distance. And the time that it took is about 2.7 seconds. right? So you can see somebody jumping and stepping out of the window. There's a big difference in how the horizontal flight distance that they would cover. I then looked at the situations of Daisel, which claimed that his body landed with the head in the direction of the building. In scenario 3, I assume that a force was applied above his center of gravity.
Mr. Moody, just to pause for a second and to sum up scenarios 1 and 2.
Yeah.
And neither of those scenarios would fit the police version in terms of distance and positioning of the body on the ground?
I do confer with that. Yes, I would say that. So the distances are beyond what the police versions are claiming, as well as his orientation and direction would be he'd be landing leg first, and his head would probably have fallen forward because he had a horizontal force pushing him forward. So his head would lie in the direction of the road, and his legs would lie in the direction of the building. So in the complete opposite direction of what Daisel found him.
I see. And also in terms of his injuries, you would have expected to have serious feet and leg injuries.
Yes.
Massive fractures, presumably.
I would believe so, because that would be his main point of impact, that region, his legs.
And presumably pelvis as well?
I wouldn't know. I'm not a medical expert to basically make a call on that, but if he landed on his feet, knowing the structure of our body, the forces would then translate up his limbs, so his bones in his limbs, and probably to his pelvis. And if you look at how the pelvis is attached to the torso, it's only connected via the spinal area, and I think that he would have dislocated his spine as well. But not being a medical expert, I wouldn't want to comment.
No, that's fair enough, thank you.
If I may, these scenarios you're painting,
Yeah.
did you consider in what direction he was facing shortly before going out of the window?
Yes.
Whether he was pushed from the back, we're talking about pushing now, from the back, or he was facing the person who was pushing him, and whether that would make a difference in terms of the trajectory.
My Lord, that would make a big difference, and I did say that earlier on. In scenario 1 and 2, I assumed that he was jumping away from the person, so he'd be facing in the direction opposite the person, so he was be facing the direction of the road, not the building. In scenario 3, he was also facing towards the road because he would have been sitting on the window ledge. In scenario 4, I assumed that he was facing the building, so he'd be looking into the window or looking into the room, more like it, and so he'd be pushed or he would have propelled backwards, if that makes sense. Okay. So in scenario 3, he would have propelled forward, face forward, and in scenario 4, he would have propelled backwards with his back, assuming the trajectory.
Okay.
Okay, so
You're on 3.3, right? Scenario 3.
Scenario 3. So scenario 3.3, basically, I assumed that Mr. Timol was placed on the windowsill, sit in a sitting position, right, and then pushed above his center of gravity. So it could have either been his back, or it could have been his shoulders, or it could have been on his head, right? And that would possibly induce a trajectory that would result in him somersaulting through it, which would probably explain why he landed with his head facing the building. In that particular scenario, I used a pushing force because now the impulse force is no longer his legs, which is the stronger limbs. The pushing force now would be hands, right? And I used an impulse force of 15 kilograms, which is a fairly medium sort of force that you'd use to push with your hands. And I assumed that he was pushed slightly above his center of gravity, his shoulders, pushed at his shoulders. And in that situation there, the height is still the same, 35 meters, and you'd find that he would have landed 3 meters away from the building. His time to fall was 2.8 seconds, the 35 meters. And again, what I did there was I used the aerodynamic coefficients presented between sitting and standing. So I took sort of a medium and I used 0.7 as a parameter to look at approximating his body through a somersault, right? And that resulted in him landing a distance of 3 meters away with a time of 2.8 seconds. If we're happy, I can move on to scenario 4, unless there's questions on that. Okay. In scenario 4, I looked at the scenario whereby his legs would have been out the window and he would have either used his hands or somebody would have pushed his upper torso out the window, so he would fall backwards through the air and he would land exactly like the way Diesel had showed, with his head in the direction of the building and on his stomach. In that particular situation, I used the same pushing force of 15 kgs to be representative with somebody pushing with hands, right? And I assumed the aerodynamic position of him flying horizontally, perpendicular to the building. And I got a distance that he would have landed away from the building at being about 3.1 meters. So what we're trying to get at is that there's not much of horizontal distance and difference between scenarios 3 and 4, the way he landed. If we have any questions on that, I'm willing to take it. Otherwise, I can move on to scenarios 5 and 6.
Mr. Moody, before we move on to 5 and 6, so just to confirm that scenarios 3 and 4 do, in your view, result in Mr. Timol landing in the orientation as described by Mr. Diesel?
Yes.
But in both scenarios 3 and 4, that would, in your opinion, involve a push out of the window?
Yes.
Thank you.
So instead of using legs to propel themselves, hands would have been used to propel his body.
But to be clear, could it potentially be his hands or somebody else's hands in terms of a push?
At this point in stage, I don't believe he would be able to move his hands as much as somebody who had free hands to be able to thrust him. So for 0.5 of a second that I used, it would be a full extension of one's arms, whereas if you looked at somebody sitting on a sill, their hands would have moved probably less than 100 millimeters if they had to release themselves from the windowsill, right? So if somebody pushed him, they would have a full extension, so probably between 0.5 meters and 0.8 meters, which would confer with the impulse force that I applied. But if somebody had to do it themselves, the impulse force would be much lower because the amount of force application would be for over a much shorter distance.
So without the aid of a push, in your view, am I correct in saying that he wouldn't have traveled the horizontal distance of 3 meters, would have likely have come a bit closer to the building?
Much closer to the building. So because his impulse force would have been much lower.
Thank you.
Moving on to scenarios 5 and 6, and that's basically looking at scenarios in line with Advocate Mattis's testimony, where according to him, he was positioned on either level 4 or 6 of the building, and said that he had good visual sight of the body falling past the window. His description of the body falling past the window was horizontal and parallel to the building. In my opinion, given the way that the window opens, it would be very difficult for an individual to be able to orientate his body, leaving perpendicular to the face of the building, rotate in mid-air in a matter of 3 seconds, and passing halfway through the building in a horizontal position parallel to the building. He would have had to have left the initial condition in that particular position. And that's why I took the liberty of looking at what happens if he was either thrown from the roof or rolled off the roof. And that's the scenarios 5 and 6. So in scenario 5, right, I assumed that 2 people carrying Mr. Timol would swing him on the roof a slight distance behind the parapet wall, because I would say it would be quite dangerous for somebody to stand at the edge and try to swing somebody and throw them. They would stand at least half a meter to a meter behind the edge, and they would release him. The force that I used there, or the impulse force that I took into consideration there, is only 20 kilograms horizontally. And the reason I did that is because those 2 people had to still carry the body, which weighed 60 kilograms, and also generate, so they would carry the body, which weighed 60 kilograms in the vertical direction, and then they would need to generate a horizontal force above that to thrust the body horizontally. Hence, I took 20 kilograms. And I used the orientation and the aerodynamic drag coefficients in line with what Advocate Mathis said about the body being parallel to the building and falling purely horizontally. And in that situation, I've got a flight distance of about 4.2 meters away from the building. But the height now was 38 meters higher because we're no longer on the 10th floor, we're on the roof of the building. And the trajectory there was roughly 2.85 seconds. I then looked at the same scenario of Mr. Mathis, and I said, what happens if somebody rolled him off the roof of the building? So they would have placed him on the parapet wall and pushed his body. So they would have to firstly overcome friction because his body would be lying flat on the surface, right? So they would literally have to push him against so there'll be a rubbing effect of his body onto the parapet wall, and then a release effect. So the force that actually would have been used to release him would have been very low, because once he left the edge, that force would no longer be applied. So I looked at a force of about 6 kilograms, which is quite a light force, but most of that force would be used, not the 6, but most of the energy or the force that the people who would push him would be used to actually push him over the surface. And when they get him over the surface, only a small force would be needed to propel him. And that situation, I ended up with a flight distance of 1.2 meters away from the wall, or from the building, and his orientation that he would have basically flew in would have been in line with what Advocate Mathis said. So those 6 scenarios sort of summarizes the different versions of information that we got in terms of how the person had left the building.
See, if we can just deal with scenarios 5 and 6.
Yes.
From what you're saying, Mr. Mudley, there's some differences between these scenarios and the earlier scenarios. And certainly there would be an inconsistency with the version of Mr. Daisel, as well as that of Brigadier Patel, who put the body approximately 3 meters or 10 feet from the edge of the building. In scenario 5, you put the distance from the edge of the building, the horizontal distance traveled at 4.2 meters. And can you just remind us what the orientation of the body would have been on landing?
So the aerodynamic coefficients that I used would have been in line with the body parallel to the building and falling horizontally, so side or stomach first,
Right.
Impacting the ground.
Right. So, the
Either
head,
he's one side or his stomach.
so unlike what Mr. Daisel says, instead of the head facing the building, it would be pointing towards the
The
double-decker
motor.
highway.
Yes.
And that would be the same in respect of scenario 6, except the horizontal distance traveled would only be just over 1.2 meters.
Yep.
In your recollection of the scene outside of that southern wing of John Vorster Square, would that have taken Mr. Timol just beyond that, what looks like a gutter, but we're told is in fact is a light tunnel, but it does have sharp concrete edges? Would that have taken Mr. Timol slightly beyond that structure?
Based on my memory, I think that structure is about 1 meter away from the building. I did not measure it, so I would not know. But I would think if it's 1.2 or 1.3 meters away, it could take him beyond that structure into the area.
We are locating the building plan, so eventually we'll get the exact measurements. The point I'm making is that we're of the belief that had he fallen onto that light well or light tunnel that looks like a gutter, then his injuries would have been substantially different, because he likely would have fallen on concrete and probably would have hit one or more of those sharp edges, and then his injuries would have been very, very different indeed. All right, Mr. Mudley, please continue with taking us through your report.
I think, having been through everything, the 6 scenarios, I would say that each of these scenarios that I've presented here, mathematically and from a mathematical model perspective, are correct. I would like to have believed that the way Mr. Timol had launched himself during the jump is in line with what most people would do when intending to jump. I would like to also believe that the evidence of Daisel with his body, where the head was pointing towards the direction, would have been the aftermath of somebody somersaulting through the air, perpendicular to it. But having gone through everything, I think that somebody jumping out of the window and only landing 3 meters away is not possible. They would have definitely landed at least between 4.5 meters and 13 meters, like I said. The Daisel's version, I think, is possible if we knew what, and if we had enough evidence of how the person left the body. If we had photographic evidence or something like that, it would have been possible. And so is Rodriguez, based on the scenarios that I put together. The question is, whose version over there is the most plausible version. And having said that, I don't think in scenarios 5 and 6 that Mr. Timol would have been able to launch himself into that orientation given the construction of that window that was there. So that's basically my 6 scenarios. I think one can read them themselves into what they see. But yeah, I have nothing further to say.
I see. Mr. Mudley, finally, I wish to return to what allegedly took place in room 1026. You have before you the photograph, which is Exhibit C8, and I believe that you have now been given an English translation of the magistrate's finding. Your Lordship, for the record, the original version is in Volume A from page 1121. The English translation is also in Volume A it's right at the back. I haven't been given a page number, but it's right behind the original Afrikaans version. And we're interested in looking at the description, the summing up of the evidence by the magistrate in relation to what happened in room 1026. And in the English translation, that's at page 28. Mr. Timol, do you have that?
No.
I thought you said you had.
The copy that I have is not numbered. The English translation is not numbered.
Oh, is it not numbered?
No, it's not numbered. What is numbered, however, is the version, the Afrikaans version.
Yes, it's unfortunate that it's not numbered. So if you can just, my Lord, count 28 pages from the beginning of the English translation, and unfortunately there are no headings to guide us either, so one actually has to count 28 pages. The top line reads, he said that he sat down on a chair. Mr. Mudley, have you found the correct page?
Yes, I have.
Okay. My Lord, have you found the page?
No,
Not yet.
No, not yet.
On page 27, there are 2 headings, the court adjourned, the court reconvened.
Page?
Well, I suppose that would be page 27. It's not in bold, it's just in capital letters.
No, I don't think, because there are no... No, I'm unable to get that, but proceed. Proceed.
Okay. And my Lord, I'm going to read out the passage, so if that helps. And I think we must number the pages. Perhaps we can attend to that after we adjourn. Mr. Mudley, I want to revisit what happened in room 1026. according to the summing up of the evidence that Magistrate de Villiers provided in respect of the evidence given by Sergeant Rodriguez. And the idea here is then to ask you, in relation to the findings of the magistrate, how long you believe it would have taken Mr. Timol to execute those moves. So I'm reading now from the top of page 28, and this is the summing up of the magistrate's finding in relation to, or the summing up of Rodriguez's evidence as provided by Magistrate de Villiers. He said that he sat down on a chair on the southern side of the table, the chair that Gloy had just vacated. Furthermore, on the photo, Exhibit S, and I believe that to be the photo that we have provided in C8, a photo of the room and its contents, the witness said that he was sitting on chair A. You see that in the photo, Mr. Moodley?
Yes.
While the deceased sat on chair B. A little while after Gloy and Van Niekerk had gone out, that's out the room, the deceased asked to go to the toilet. The deceased was sitting on chair B. As I have already mentioned, both of them got up. Rodriguez said he went to the left, and I presume that's his left, where chair C was in his way. At that moment, his eyes were on the chair, that's chair C. He pushed it in, and then he saw the deceased. He was standing on the right-hand side of the table from where Rodriguez was, rushing towards the window. The witness said he first wanted to go to the left, but the chair that the deceased had just vacated, chair B, would have been in his way, and he went back to the right, where he had trouble with chair A, which was in his way. At this moment, the deceased was already at the window. The window was already open, and he was busy diving through the window. In an attempt to grab the deceased, he stumbled over chair A. He could not even touch the deceased. When he got to the window, he said that he saw the deceased lying on the ground next to the building. He immediately ran to Colonel Groening's office to report, and that part of the summing up is not relevant for our purposes. So, Mr. Moodley, if we were to ask you to give an estimation, in your view, of the time it took Mr. Timol to execute those moves, starting from his position in seat B and eventually ending up at the window and exiting that window, would you still say that it was, I think your evidence earlier was between 5 and 8 seconds?
So, in my evidence earlier, I basically assumed that he had moved in the direction of the door and then basically moved towards his, Mr. Timol's, left, which is to exit the left window. If he had just moved from the chair directly around the table into that direction and still climb up to get out of that window, I would be more inclined to confirm around 5 seconds, maybe 4 to 6 seconds. I can't see him being able to do that in a shorter period of time, because there's a lot of changing of direction in movement. Left, then right, and then up. And every change in movement requires some sort of time and some sort of difference in reaction So when you think about how we move, we react according to what our brain would tell us to move, right? And there's a period where we think about a reaction and then we execute it. And when we look at accidents on people driving, they always consider a reaction time before the person actually applies his brake. In a similar way, for somebody to change direction, he would have to process the information that he wants to change direction and then execute it, that he's going to change direction. So that there is a time frame to that. It doesn't happen instantaneously.
Thank you. Your Lordship, no further questions.
Thank you. Advocate Thomas? Yes. Yes, Advocate Utsi?
I do have questions. Thank you. I understand, and I was not present, but that witness Patel testified that the body was lying plus minus 10 feet away from the building. Transferring into meters, that is about 3 meters, more or less 3 meters. If one look at the scenarios that you have established with regard to the distance of 3 meters, it seems to me that your scenario 3 more or less has 3 meters, your scenario 4 has 3 meters, and for that purpose your scenario 2 has got 4 meters. That is the scenarios that you, and the scenarios of 3 meters, would that is possibly then within what Patel has testified. Now, you must just answer. Sorry.
Yes. Yeah.
So then Dr. Naidu testified that the deceased fell head first, according to his opinion, head first, and then to the right shoulder, transferring the body. Would that have made a difference to you if you knew that, or if you take that into account?
So in scenario 3, I did take into consideration a somersault maneuver, which means that he would have rotated out the window in a head-first position, but he would have completed a full rotation, which would have then resulted in landing on his stomach.
Now, with regard to the flight time, in other words, the time of the duration in air, mid-air, it seems to me in scenario 1 is the maximum time, which is about just over 3.5 seconds. And that's more or less the longest period that you anticipate that he might have been falling.
Yes, sir.
Yes. Now, if one take that into account, and one take into account Advocate Mattis's observation through the window, and you've seen also the sizes of these windows, how long observation would you have had of the falling body?
I don't have it on me here, but he would have fallen at a few meters per second, definitely more than the height of, so you would have seen it within less than a second, the body passing there, because he would have fallen much more than 1.5 meters, much faster than 1.5 meters per second, which is the height of the window.
Yes. So it would have been less than a second observation.
Yeah. Yes.
And speaking of that, you have referred to the reaction time, and it seems to me that from your CV and what you've said, that you also do some accident reconstructions. Do you do that?
I don't do accident reconstruction, but what I do is engineering analysis of vehicles, suspension systems, braking systems, to see how effective vehicles can maneuver at high speeds.
If I may ask you, do you know what is the average reaction time of a person? In other words, if I notice something from noticing something to reaction time, what would that be, the delay?
If you're driving and you're paying attention, right, it could be between, I would say, 0.4 and 0.5 seconds. If you're not paying attention, it could be a little bit longer.
It could be longer. Yeah. If we look, for example, at Sergeant Rodriguez, his reaction time, you would not be able to say what would be a person beginning to leave an office with the purpose of leaving an office, what would his reaction time have been?
No, I couldn't say that.
Thank you. So have you done any, and I appreciate your graphs and the maths involved in the graphs, have you done any actual testing, for example, with crash test dummies in the falling trajectories of that form or that type of substance?
No, not within this time frame that we had, but the paper that we used experimental data combined with computational fluid dynamics data to work out the drag effect on the body. So another point that I want to raise is this. When the body fell, the fact that it started with the initial condition of a zero velocity, it took time to accelerate to higher speeds, and the body fell mostly with the gravitational force, and the aerodynamics forces and stuff was not as large as the rotational forces, unlike in a situation where somebody is skydiving and they have hundreds of meters
Yes.
in which to maneuver in.
Yes. And obviously it would also be different for people, for example, that do cliff diving or do
Skydiving.
where they will purposely project themselves as far away from the cliff to do skydiving or whatever they do.
Yes.
So then, with regard to these graphs and the maths that you have applied there must be some variables that would influence all of these aspects. Have you considered any variables, for example, the clothing, whether something else is on the way down, hit like a ledge or anything like that? Have you taken any of those into account?
In this particular, at this particular speeds, the clothing effect would form what we call a profile drag effect, right? These speeds are still too low for that to be considered as any sort of additional restraint or additional drag coefficient, or have any value to it.
And just one issue, and I've asked this because I haven't been to that area and I haven't inspected. Are there protruding ledges from the building?
From when we looked out the window that we saw, currently there is a louver sort of face that was installed afterwards, I believe, but the building is almost flat. So if there's anything that's protruding, I wouldn't think it would be more than 100 millimeters. There's no balconies or anything below it or anything. It's almost a flat face.
Yeah, so you've referred to the parapet wall on the roof.
Yes.
What is the height of the parapet?
It's between about, I would say, 300 and 500 millimeters. It's about knee height for me.
Yes. Thank you, my lord. I have dealt with questions.
Yes. Any further questions?
My lord, just one. For purposes of clarification, Mr. Moodley, it was put to you that by my learned friend for the police that according to Dr. Naidu, Mr. Timol fell head first. Do you have a copy of Dr. Naidu's report with you?
Not on hand.
Not on hand. In fact, at paragraph 22 of Dr. Naidu's report, exhibit number, We'll get you the exhibit number shortly. It's exhibit C3, my lord. His evidence is not quite that he fell head first, as in straight down. In fact, he says as follows: "My impressions obtained from the injuries are that the body struck the ground, primary impact, with the forehead and the area of the right shoulder, elbow, chest." And if I recall his oral testimony, he said the body struck the ground in a side position, striking initially the areas that I've just mentioned. If you wish to comment on that, you may.
If you could ask a question, then maybe I could answer it, but I think you're making a statement.
I'm simply making a statement. If there's no comment, then we can leave it at that. Thank you, Lord Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mundri. That will be all from you. Thank you very much. You want to say something?
No, thank you, my lord.
Oh, okay, thank you. You're excused. All right, Mr. Van.
Your Lordship, that concludes the evidence for today. Unless my learned colleagues have anything further. My Lord, the only thing that we can do is to assist you with your research is to hand up a numbered copy of the English translation of the inquest finding.
Yes, okay, thank you.
So, Your Lord, nothing further. I understand that my learned friend for the police will be calling certain witnesses for Monday and Tuesday.
Yes. Would you like to say something about that, Mr. Advocate?
Lord, there's just one issue. As on the record yesterday at the closing that we were discussing the calling of Brigadier Chabalala. As we have discussed earlier in Chambers, I've excused him as I don't believe it is necessary in the light of the affidavit that he presented to the court regarding Mr. Ahmed Adam. So I will not be calling him in this regard.
Yes.
And by Monday, I will be ready to present evidence.
Okay.
Thank you.
We're expecting 2 witnesses Monday.
Two witnesses.
That's Mr. Els and Mr. Rodriguez.
And Mr. Rodriguez will be present on Monday.
Yes. Are they still going by the titles, Sergeant Rodriguez or Mr. Rodriguez? You know.
Mr. Now, they haven't been in the police service for many years. They're not on the title or a rank.
Okay.
They will be listed.
Then we'll agenda proceedings until Monday, 10 o'clock in this room. Thank you.